The summer of 1961, on a back road outside of Lacombe, Alberta, a 38-year-old woman named Sylvia Holt paid $40 for 12 heritage apple trees that the county agricultural office was throwing away. Not selling, throwing away. The trees were being cleared from the experimental station on the edge of town. Old fam use and wealthy varieties the province had stopped funding, replaced by newer commercial stock. The extension officer, a man named Walter Briggs, who had been telling farmers what to grow for 22 years, had called 3 orchardists in the area and been told the same thing. Those old varieties produced too small, too uneven, couldn't move them at auction, no point. The trees would be burned by the end of August. Sylvia heard about it from her neighbor's wife, who had heard about it from the woman at the grain elevator office, who had heard about it from Walter Briggs himself, who had mentioned it while picking up a soil amendment order. She drove to the station on a Thursday morning in late July. Briggs was in the office sorting paperwork. He looked up when she came in and, to his credit, did not immediately tell her she was wasting her time. "You are here about the apple trees," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her the way a tired man looks at an unexpected complication. "Mrs. Holt." "Yes. Though I have to tell you, 3 people have already said no. I am not here to say no. I want to walk them first." He handed her a set of keys to the experimental block and went back to his paperwork. She spent an hour and a half in that orchard. She walked every row. She checked the graft unions. She looked at the bark for sign of canker. She tasted 2 apples from a famuse that had no business producing fruit in late July, but was doing it anyway. Pale green and tart and remarkable. She looked at the root crowns. She looked at how the trees had been pruned, badly in some cases, but not without remedy. When she came back to the office, she had a number in her head. 12 of the famuse in the old wealthy, she said. The ones in the north half of Block 3. "What will you take for them?" Briggs put down his pen. "Mrs. Holt, those trees are 30 years old. Some of them are closer to 40. Commercial production on old famuse is, well, it is not a sound investment." "I did not ask your opinion of the investment. I asked what you will take." He thought about it. The cost of burning was not nothing. The cost of someone else removing them was not nothing. $40, he said, mostly to have a number. She wrote him a check on the spot. She told him she would be back with her son-in-law and a borrowed flatbed on Saturday morning. She asked him to make sure the irrigation was left on until then. He agreed, more out of surprise than generosity. She drove home and told her husband Douglas to find a long-reach spade. Douglas Holt was a quiet man who had learned in 17 years of marriage that certain conversations with his wife were informational rather than negotiable. He found the spade. The trees were on her property in Lacombe County by Saturday evening. Her hired hand, a young man named Pete, who had been working the Holt place for 2 seasons and thought he understood the operation, stood at the edge of the yard watching them unload the last tree. He had that particular expression of a person who wants to ask a question and is weighing whether it is worth asking. Sylvia saw it. "Go ahead," she said. He took off his cap. "Mrs. Holt, you have got 40 acres of grain right now. You have got the vegetable plot and the soft fruit and the chickens. Where exactly are you going to put heritage apple trees that nobody in the county wants?" She looked at him steadily. "In the ground, Pete." He put his cap back on. "Yes, ma'am. But heritage apples. The co-op won't take them. The packing houses want Max and Delicious. You know that. What are you going to do with the fruit?" She looked at the trees laid out in the yard in the last light of a July evening, their root balls wrapped in burlap, their bark the color of old pewter. "I will tell you when it is ready," she said. She walked to the house. Pete stood in the yard alone with 12 apple trees and the distinct feeling that he had just been told something he did not yet have the context to understand. By the end of that week, Lacombe had a story to tell. Sylvia Holt had gone to the agricultural station and paid $40 for 12 trees the province was going to burn. Old heritage varieties. Nobody had grown commercially in 20 years. The story moved the way stories move in farming country. From the elevator to the feed store, from the feed store to the church hall, from the church hall to the co-op meeting on a Tuesday night. And at every stop it got a little more inexplicable, because Sylvia Holt was not the kind of woman Lacombe expected to be planting trees that had no market. To understand what she did over the next 14 years, you have to understand where she came from. Sylvia was born in 1923 in Peace River, the second of 4 children raised by her mother almost entirely alone after her father, a Ukrainian homesteader named Walter Kovalenko, broke his back in a grain bin accident when she was 11. Her mother, Rose, kept the place running through the Depression through a combination of stubbornness and kitchen mathematics that Sylvia would not fully appreciate until she was 40. Rose grew everything. She kept a root cellar that neighbors came to in February when their own stores ran out. She grafted apple varieties she had brought from her own mother's farm in Saskatchewan, trees that had no commercial value and complete practical value, trees that produced into October in a climate that gave most orchardists fits. Sylvia grew up understanding that a farm was not a business plan. It was a library. Every plant was a piece of stored knowledge about what the land could do if you asked it the right question. She had gone to normal school in Edmonton, trained as a teacher, taught grade 3 and 4 in a school outside of Wetaskiwin for 6 years. She had married Douglas Holt in 1944 when he came back from overseas, thinner than he had left, and with a quiet that had not been there before. She had moved to the Holt home place in Lacombe County in the spring of 1945 and spent the first year learning a different kind of country than she had grown up in. She had taken over the books in the second year, the planting decisions in the third, and the full operation in everything but name by 1950, when Douglas's back made it impossible for him to do the heavy work himself. Douglas was not diminished by this. He had married a woman who could read a soil line from 50 feet away, and he had known it when he married her. He ran the equipment. She ran everything else. It worked. She ran the grain operation the way her mother had run her Peace River place, conservatively, observantly, with a margin she called the quiet reserve, a strip of land along the creek that she never broke, never grazed, never seeded to crop, held in native grass and shrub and the kind of biologically untidy vegetation that her neighbors called waste ground, and she called the farm's memory. In 1957, she had begun reading, not the grain extension bulletins which said what the county wanted to hear. She had a subscription to a horticultural journal out of Ontario, 2 agricultural publications from the United Kingdom, and 1 quarterly paper out of an agricultural research station in Nova Scotia that nobody in central Alberta had ever heard of. The Nova Scotia Journal was where she had first read, in the winter of 1958, about the commercial revival of heritage apple varieties for direct farm sales and cider production in the Maritime provinces and in Quebec. Not auction sales, not packing house contracts, direct sales from the farm gate to people who wanted something different from what the grocery chain offered. The writer of the article, a woman named Dr. Joan Lachance at the Kentville Research Station, had noted something Sylvia found more interesting than the economics. Heritage varieties produced irregular fruit. They produced fruit in a staggered sequence across the summer and fall, unlike commercial varieties bred for harvest uniformity. And many heritage varieties, particularly the old French-Canadian types like Fameux and St. Laurent, had root systems and disease resistance profiles built over decades in northern climates, specifically resistance that newer commercial stock bred in American conditions simply did not have. They were built for winters like Alberta winters. They had just never been asked. Sylvia had been thinking about those trees since 1958. She had been corresponding with Dr. Lachance since 1959. A letter exchange that produced, over 2 years, 6 pages of handwritten notes about soil preparation, rootstock compatibility, intercropping possibilities, and the specific cold hardiness of varieties the province had decided were commercially unviable. She had known what she was going to do well before Walter Briggs mentioned that the experimental station trees were going to be burned. When she heard, she had a site already selected, a soil test already conducted, and a planting plan already drawn in pencil on the back of a seed catalog. The $40 had not been an impulse. It had been the end of a 3-year preparation. That is what nobody in Lacombe understood when the story went around at the co-op meeting. They were watching a woman pay for garbage. They were actually watching a woman complete a plan she had been building since before the Diefenbaker government. Let her tell you about the first 4 years, because this is where Sylvia Holt proved that correspondence with a research station in Nova Scotia and the willingness to be laughed at are worth more than a co-op membership and a standing contract with a packing house. She planted the 12 trees in a sheltered block on the northwest side of the farm, in ground she had been amending with compost and green manure since the previous fall. She planted them in a grid that allowed for future expansion, with spacing based on the recommendations from Dr. Shar. Lacombe rather than the Extension Service's standard commercial orchard spacing. Pete helped her dig the holes. He did not say anything else about the co-op. In the second year, she planted another 8 trees, Duchess of Oldenburg and Northern Spy, sourced from a small heritage nursery in Ontario she had found through the Nova Scotia Journal. In the third year, she planted 14 more, including 2 varieties of crabbly along the perimeter rows that she had noted in Dr. Lacombe's research as beneficial for cross-pollination and for producing a high pectin fruit she intended to use in her own processing. Douglas built her a cold storage cellar under the north end of the equipment shed in the winter of 1963. He did not ask what it was for. He had been watching her walk the orchard block every evening after supper since 1961 in exactly the way he had watched her walk the grain fields when she was making a rotation decision. Douglas Holt was a man who understood that some plans took time to become visible. By 1964, she had 41 trees. The first real harvest came that fall. 112 bushels of apples from varieties that had not been commercially grown in Alberta in a generation, irregular size, beautiful flavor, entirely unmarketable through any conventional channel. She put an advertisement in the Lacombe Globe. Heritage apples, farm direct, September and October, bring your own bags. She priced them at $1/4 a pound, which was above what Macs were selling for at the grocery counter. On the first Saturday, 11 families drove out. On the second Saturday, 31 families drove out. 3 of them had come from Red Deer, 40 minutes away. A woman from Ponoka bought 4 bushels and asked if Sylvia made cider. She did not yet, she noted it in her notebook. By the end of October, she had sold 88 bushels from the farm gate and processed the remaining 24 into dried apple rings and a small run of preserves that she sold through a church sale and a farm market in Lacombe. Her gross return on that first harvest was $312 from 41 trees on approximately half an acre of production ground. The Extension Office sold apples on a cost-per-acre basis. On that basis, what Sylvia was doing was interesting but marginal. She was not thinking about it that way. She was thinking about what 40 families from Lacombe and Red Deer and Ponoka had told her while they stood in her orchard choosing their own fruit, which was that they had not tasted an apple like this since their grandmothers had kept trees, and that they would come back. She kept records. Every customer who left a name, every question asked, every variety that ran out first. She was building something the Extension Service did not have a category for because in 1964, in central Alberta, the category did not exist yet. Pete stayed with her. He had started, somewhere around the second year, to refer to the orchard block as his orchard block, in the way that people adopt things they initially doubted. By 1965, he was the one writing down the pest observations and the pruning notes without being asked. The word got around differently than the first story had gotten around. Not as a joke this time, as a question. Neighbors drove past the Holt place on the county road and noticed that the block on the northwest side looked different, lusher, denser with growth than the surrounding fields. A few of them stopped. Sylvia showed them the trees. She showed them the record books. She showed them the customer list and the sellout dates by variety. She did not tell them what to do. She let them look and reach their own conclusions. A few of them reached the right ones. Most were not ready. A grain farmer in Lacombe County in 1966 had 3 generations of certainty, telling him that fruit trees were a hobby and a grocery supplement, not a farm enterprise, and 2 Saturday afternoons in Sylvia Holt's orchard were not going to change that. But 2 of them, sisters named Audrey and June, who ran their family place outside of Bentley together, started a small orchard of their own in 1967. They ordered trees from the same Ontario nursery. Their neighbors looked at them the way everyone had looked at Sylvia. Then came the summer of 1972. The winter of 1971 to 1972 had been hard in ways that mattered specifically to orchardists. A late warm spell in March had pushed a number of commercial apple varieties in Alberta into early bud break. Then, in the 3rd week of April, a killing frost came back, the temperature dropping to -18 in a single night and stayed cold for 6 more days. The damage to early budding commercial trees across central Alberta was extensive. The Red Delicious and Golden Delicious blocks that had been planted through the 60s in response to grocery chain contracts, the trees that every extension agent in 3 counties had been recommending for a decade, lost between 60 and 90% of their buds set in that single April frost. It was not the drought of 1988 in Montana. It was a different kind of crisis, quieter, regional, confined to orchardists rather than the entire farming community. But for the farms that had planted commercial varieties on commercial advice over the previous 15 years, it was ruinous. 2 orchards outside of Ponoka were done entirely. A larger operation near Olds lost a full season's income and took a production loan it would carry for 3 years. The packing house contracts that had seemed so stable in 1965 were suddenly being renegotiated at prices that did not cover operating costs. Sylvia lost 4% of her bud set that April. Her famous trees, which had been grown from rootstock that had wintered in Nova Scotia for 30 years before she bought them, budded 2 weeks later than the commercial varieties. The April frost had come and gone before they were vulnerable. Her Duchess trees, which the Extension Service had told her were marginally commercial at best, produced a full crop. Her Northern Spy, which no one had grown in Alberta for 20 years because the packing houses would not contract them, came through the frost entirely unaffected and produced 168 bushels that fall from 14 trees. She did not sell a single family's worth of fruit short that year. She did not lose a contract because she had never built her operation on contracts that required the weather to cooperate in April. She had built it on direct relationships with people who drove out to the farm and picked their own apples in September and October, and those people came back in 1972 the same as they had come in 1968 and 1965. She had 112 families on her customer list by then. People who sent her Christmas cards. People who called in August to ask what the crop was looking like. People who brought their children, who then grew up and came back with their own children. Walter Briggs, the extension officer who had handed her the keys to the experimental block in 1961, came out to the Holt place in September of 1972. He was 54 years old. He had been giving agricultural advice in Lacombe County for 33 years. He walked the orchard block with Sylvia in the late afternoon, past trees that were full of fruit, while the commercial orchards he had recommended for a decade were coming off a fractional harvest. He did not say much for a long time. She did not help him by filling with silence. Finally, at the end of the 3rd row, he stopped. "Mrs. Holt," he stopped again. "I sent 3 people away from those trees in 1961. 3 orchardists who could have had what you have." "Yes." He looked at the nearest tree, a famous that was loaded in the particular way that well-managed old trees are loaded, not heavy on a few main branches, but distributed and balanced and deeply rooted. "I told them commercial viability," he said. "I told them auction market standards. I told them the packing houses." She did not say, "I know." She did not say, "I told you so." She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the orchard had not already said. He took his glasses off and cleaned them on his shirt, put them back on. "These trees were built for this climate," he said quietly, "and I told people to plant something else." "Yes." Sylvia said it the way a person says something they have known for 11 years, without weight, without unkindness, as a fact that had waited a patient amount of time to be spoken aloud. They walked back to the house. She put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and did not say much else. When he left, an hour later, he shook her hand at the door. The Lacombe Globe ran a piece in November of 1972 about the orchard operations in the county that had come through the spring frost with viable harvests. Sylvia was one of 2 named in the article. The other was a larger commercial operation that had, through luck of microclimate and late planted stock, escaped the worst of the April damage. The reporter asked Sylvia what had made the difference. She said, "I planted trees that were built for Alberta winters, not trees that were built for Washington state summers." She poured him coffee and offered him an apple from the bowl on the counter. A famous, round and pale and firm, the kind of apple that did not exist on any grocery shelf in Canada in November of 1972. He ate it and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That is remarkable." "Yes," she said, My mother grew them. Let her tell you how it ended, because the ending is the part Rose Kovalenko would have understood from her Peace River root cellar without needing a single word of explanation. Sylvia ran the orchard and the grain operation together on the Holt place until 1979, when Douglas passed in the spring of a heart that had been giving them warning signs for 2 years. She kept going. She had not been running that farm with Douglas for a long time in the practical sense, and she had been running it without him in the grief sense that takes years to work through. And she did both things the way she did everything, without advertising either. In 1981, she handed the orchard operation to her daughter Margaret, who had been helping with the farm gate sales since she was 15 and had her mother's habit of watching a thing carefully before deciding what it was. Margaret had married a man named Howard who had grown up on a mixed farm outside of Stettler and was not frightened of orchard work or of women who knew more about fruit trees than he did. Margaret and Howard run the place today. The orchard block has expanded 4 times since Sylvia planted those first 12 trees in 1961. There are 208 trees now, across 9 heritage varieties, on just under 3 acres of production ground. The cold storage cellar Douglas built under the equipment shed in 1963 was replaced in 1991 with a proper commercial cold room. The customer list that Sylvia kept in a lined notebook has been a computer database since 1997 and currently contains over 400 families, some of them third-generation customers whose grandparents drove out on a Saturday morning in the autumn of 1964 because they saw an advertisement in the Lacombe Globe. Pete retired in 1983. He came back the following spring to help with the pruning and came back every spring after that until his knees made it impossible, which took another 12 years. In 1988, the year the drought was burning through every ranch in Montana and every cattleman on the northern plains was selling off what he could not feed, Lacombe County had a dry summer that hurt the grain but left the orchard largely intact. Margaret wrote her mother a letter about the harvest that fall. It was an ordinary letter, farm news and family news, the kind of letter women in that family had always written. But it contained a line that Sylvia read twice and then set on the kitchen table and looked at for a while. Pete says the old famuse in the north row has the heaviest set we have ever seen. He says it looks exactly the way it looked in 1972. He says some trees remember what they are supposed to do. In 1993, the Alberta Horticultural Association invited Sylvia to speak at their annual meeting in Edmonton. She was 70 years old. She had been retired for 12 years. She had never spoken publicly about the farm, the trees, or the $40 she had spent in 1961 on something Walter Briggs was going to burn. She almost said no. Margaret drove up from the farm and sat with her for 2 days until she said yes. Sylvia stood at the podium in Edmonton with a single index card she did not look at. She spoke for 14 minutes without notes and sat down. She said this: "People ask me why I planted heritage trees when every signal in the market said not to. That is the wrong question. The right question is why those trees were being burned in the first place." She paused. Those trees were built over 40 years for northern winters. They were disease-resistant in our conditions. They produced across 3 months instead of 3 weeks. They were not bred to travel 2,000 miles in a refrigerated truck. They were bred to grow in Alberta and be eaten in Alberta. We discarded them because a packing house in Vancouver wanted uniform size and an auction price, and because an extension service told farmers that uniform and auctionable was the same as valuable. It is not the same thing. It has never been the same thing. It is a confusion of market convenience for agricultural truth, and it has been the most expensive confusion in Canadian horticulture for 50 years. She paused again. In 1972, the spring frost took 60 to 90% of the bud set on commercially recommended apple stock across central Alberta. My farm lost 4%. Not because my land was sheltered. My land is not sheltered. Because the trees I planted had been designed by 40 years of northern winters to bud 2 weeks later than the varieties the Extension Service recommended, and I had planted them because a researcher in Nova Scotia had told me what they could do, and I had believed her instead of the co-op. She picked up the index card, looked at it once, set it back down. My mother kept famous trees on a farm in Peace River in 1935. She kept them because they were her mother's trees, and her mother had brought them from Saskatchewan, and they were the only apple variety that reliably produced in that climate, in that decade. She did not keep them because they were commercially viable. She kept them because they were true. That is a word we do not use much in agriculture. True, but it is the right word. A plant that is true is one that is built for the ground it grows in, and my mother knew the difference between a true plant and a convenient one. She gave that knowledge to me. I gave it to my daughter. My daughter is giving it to her children. She looked out at the room. That is what I paid $40 for in 1961. Not 12 apple trees. The right to grow things that are true. The room was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of people reaching for something they feel they already knew. Audrey and June were in the audience. They were in their mid-60s by then. They had been running their orchard outside of Bentley for 26 years. They had come through 1972 with a full harvest. They had a customer list of their own and a cold storage room their brother had built them in 1975. After the speech, Audrey found Sylvia in the corridor. $40, she said. Sylvia smiled. We paid $65 in 1967, Audrey said, for 18 trees from the same Ontario nursery. People drove past our place for 2 years and looked at us like we had lost our minds. I remember, Sylvia said. You knew in 1961 what you were doing. I knew what I was trying to do. There is a difference. Audrey looked at her. June and I came to your farm gate in September of 1964. We bought 2 bags. We ate one on the drive home. I remember. You both came back the following year. We came back every year, Audrey said, and then we started our own. Because you showed us that something nobody wanted could be exactly what people needed, if you gave it enough time and enough ground. Sylvia nodded slowly. That is how it happens, she said, one farm at a time, one frost at a time. She paused. Tell me something. What did you see when you looked at 12 old trees on a station block in 1961 that nobody had looked at in years? Audrey thought about it honestly. We saw something past its time. We saw trees the province didn't want anymore. Sylvia shook her head gently. I saw 40 years of survival built into the wood. I saw root systems that knew Alberta February. I saw 3 months of fruit where the commercial catalogs showed 3 weeks. I saw what a farm in Peace River had taught me to see, that the thing nobody wants is sometimes the thing that was built for exactly the place you are standing. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor, at the flat October light coming through it. $40, she said again, and a Wednesday afternoon, and the patience to wait for 1972. Everyone who walked past those trees in 1961 saw firewood. Sylvia Holt saw her mother's orchard. She saw the knowledge built into a root system over 40 northern winters, the disease resistance no breeding catalog had cataloged, the bud timing no extension bulletin had measured. She saw a farm that had been asking the wrong question for 20 years, asking what the packing house wanted rather than what the land already knew how to grow. She saw 12 living answers to a problem that nobody in Lacombe County had properly named yet. She paid $40 and planted them in ground she had been preparing for 2 years. She grew them forward through 14 years of being considered eccentric and 1 season of being proven right. She handed them to her daughter and her daughter's daughter, the way her mother had handed her a knowledge of true things in a root cellar in Peace River. And the trees went on doing what they had been built to do, which was survive the winters, come late through the frost, and produce the kind of fruit that makes a person stop on a farm road in September and remember something they did not know they had forgotten. I keep thinking about the $40. Not because it was a small amount, though it was. Not because it bought something remarkable, though it did. I think about it because of what it represents. The distance between what a thing is worth on paper and what a person of clear sight understands it to be worth in practice. Walter Briggs looked at those 12 trees and saw a disposal problem. Sylvia Holt looked at them and saw 40 years of survival built into the wood. Same trees, completely different eyes. That difference did not come from luck. It came from the kind of honest, disciplined attention that most of us intend to practice and few of us actually do. Sylvia read journals. Nobody around her was reading. She wrote letters to a researcher in Nova Scotia. She walked the experimental block for an hour and a half and put her hands on every tree before she made a decision. That is not cleverness exactly. That is something more like integrity of mind. The refusal to let convenience or consensus replace actual looking. When the world tells you something has no value, the honest response is not to accept that verdict. It is to go and look for yourself. And when she looked, she trusted what she found. Even when it cost her the co-op's goodwill. Even when Pete stood in the yard with that expression. Even when the story made the rounds at the church hall as a joke about a woman who bought firewood for $40, she did not waver, not because she was stubborn, but because she had done the work, and the work had given her something solid to stand on. That is the thing about real understanding. It does not need the room's approval to remain true. Then there is what she did with 14 years of being considered eccentric. She showed up. Every evening walking the orchard, every fall noting which variety sold out first, every letter to Nova Scotia, every entry in the record book, every Saturday at the farm gate. Nobody was watching. Nobody was keeping score. The discipline that built that orchard was almost entirely invisible, the kind of sustained, unremarkable effort that only becomes legible in retrospect when the April frost comes and your trees bud 2 weeks late and the difference is everything. Cause and consequence, in farming and in life, operate on a longer clock than we usually have patience for. Sylvia planted in 1961. The proof came in 1972. 11 years of quiet work between the decision and the vindication. I think about that whenever I am tempted to abandon something because it is not showing results yet. The roots are building. The root systems that carried those trees through a killing frost in April were built in years when nothing visible was happening, in ordinary Alberta winters, in unremarkable ground that had been prepared with care and then left alone to do its work. What Sylvia passed to Margaret, and what Margaret is passing forward still, is not just an orchard. It is a way of knowing, the kind that comes from looking closely, thinking honestly, and staying at something long enough for the land to show you what it already knows. $40, a Wednesday afternoon, 14 years of patience. The trees nobody wanted are still producing fruit.